I now recognize the ranking member for any concluding remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, today has been interesting, I guess, to say the least. It has been, we have found many things. In fact, 3 of our 4 witnesses here today alleged numerous crimes committed by the president. And at times it seemed like we were even trying to make up crimes as we go out. Well, if it wasn't this, well, it was the intent to do it. It went along that is interesting today as I started this day, and I'm going to come back to it now. As much as I respect these who came before us today, this is way too early. Because we've not, as a committee, done our job. We've not, as a committee, come together, looked at evidence, taken fact witnesses, put people here in front of us under oath to say what happened and how did it happen and why did it happen. We're taking the work of the Intel Committee and the other committees. We're taking it seemingly at face value, and I will remind all that the chairman even is the biggest proponent of this not happening in his earlier statements almost 20 years ago when he said we should not take a report from another entity and just accept it, otherwise we are a rubber stamp. Now, to my Democratic majority, they may not care, because as I've said before, this is about a clock and a calendar. A clock and a calendar. They're so obsessed with the election next year that they just gloss over things. In fact, what is interesting is, as I said earlier, 3 of the 4 witnesses alleged numerous crimes committed by the president. However, during the Intel Committee hearings, none of the fact witnesses identified a crime. If you're writing about this, that should alarm you. So this impeachment narrative being spun by the majority is a fake one. It's majority spinning 3% of the facts while ignoring 90% of the 7% of the other. In fact, Professor Turley earlier said today, impeachment needs proof, not presumptions. We have one of the fact witnesses in the Intel Committee. I presumed that was what was going on, Mr. Sonderland. You know what is happening here today is also we found out today, I thought it was really interesting. This is the Judiciary Committee, but we also found out something today, that facts don't matter. In fact, facts don't matter unless we can fit those facts to fit the narrative we want to spin before this committee and the American people. If they don't matter, we also heard one of the witnesses state today that it doesn't matter if aid was released or not. Of course it matters. But unfortunately, the only one of the many facts ignored by the majority. They're ignoring a ton of substantive facts that matter. It apparently doesn't matter to the Democrats that Ambassador Volker, the former special envoy to the Ukraine, made clear in his testimony there was no conditionality on the White House meeting or the aid. The Democrats and their witnesses haven't mentioned that because it's unhelpful to the narrative they're spinning. It apparently doesn't matter that to the Democrats and the majority here, that the president did not condition his aid on an investigation. In fact, Mr. Sondland's statement is to the contrary, was presumption. It was right here in this room. He called it a guess, right where you're sitting. Called it a guess, a presumption. That's what he thought. God forbid if we walk into our courtrooms or in our proceedings now to find somebody guilty of something we're calling a crime, and we walk into court now and all of a sudden, well, I thought it was. The witness said, I presumed it was. God forbid this is where we're at. But you know, we've also heard today that you can make inference, though. It's okay if you're just inferring. I don't know about the professors here, for those of us in court on both sides of the aisle, I've never heard him go in and hear a judge say, just infer what you think they meant, and that'll be enough. It's not inference. You know, it probably doesn't matter that the president didn't condition a meeting on an investigation. He met with Zelensky with no preconditions. Zelensky didn't even find out about the hold on the aid until it was after a month after the call when he read it in Politico. The aid was released shortly thereafter, and Ukraine didn't have anything to do to get the aid released. Not only was the aid released, but lethal aid was given as well. And if you think that doesn't matter, there were 5 meetings between the time the aid was stopped and the time the aid was released, and in none of those meetings, between ambassadors and others, including the vice president and senators, none of that was ever connected to a promise of anything on the aid. Nothing was ever connected. 5 times. And 2 of those were after President Zelensky learned that aid was being held. Tell me there's not a problem here with the story. That's why fact witnesses aren't here right now. The evidence against the president is really about policy differences. In fact, 3 of the Democratic star witnesses, Hill, Taylor, and Kent, weren't even on the call. They read transcripts like everyone else. On July 26, Zelensky met with Volker and Sondland and made no reference to quid pro quo or hold on aid. They met several more times, no references, but none of none of these inconvenient facts or so many other inconvenient facts matter to the majority. Moreover, we don't even know what, if additional hearings, we will have to address other facts. This is the part that bothers me greatly. It is something we have seen from January of this year. No concern about a process that works, but simply a getting to an end that we want. You know, I agree with Professor Feldman. He may find that strange, but I do agree with you on something. It's not his job to assess the credibility of witnesses, it's this committee's job. And I agree. But this committee can't do our jobs if none of the witnesses testify before our committee, even ones that we have talked about calling today, and the majority has said we don't want. To do that, we still don't have an answer on what this committee will do once this hearing ends. The committee received Mr. Chairman Schiff's report yesterday, but we still don't have the underlying evidence. The rules even set up by this body are not being followed to this day, but yet nobody talks about it on the majority side. The witnesses produced by Chairman Schiff and the American people talked about their feelings, their guesses, their presumptions, but even though the facts may not matter to the majority, 97% of the other facts do matter to the American people. So my problem is this. As the ranking member of this committee, one of the oldest, most should-be fact-based, legal-based committees we have here, where impeachment should have been all along. I have a group of members who have no idea where we're headed next. I bet you, though, if I ask the majority members outside the chairman, they don't have a clue either. Very much one. Because if they haven't, they should share it. Because this is not a time to play hide the ball. This is not a time to say, we're going to figure it out on the fly. You're talking about overturning 63 million votes of a president duly elected who is doing his job every day. And by the way, was overseas today while we're doing this, working with our NATO allies. So the question I have is, where do we head next? We've heard this ambiguous presentation, but here's my challenge. I've already been voted down and tabled today. Mr. Schiff should testify. Chairman Schiff, not his staff, must appear before this committee to answer questions about the content of his report. That's what Ken Starr did 20 years ago, and history demanded. I told the chairman just a while ago and a couple of weeks ago when we were doing a markup, I said, Mr. Chairman, the history lights are on us. It is time that we talk and share how we're going forward. I'm still waiting for answers. So, Mr. Chairman, as we look ahead, as the Democratic majority promised that this was going to be a fair process when it got to judiciary for the president and others. The president, and you may say he could have come today, what would have this done? Nothing. There's no fact witnesses here, nothing to rebut. In fact, it's been a good time just to see that really nothing came of it at the end of the day. So why should he be here? Let's bring fact witnesses in. Let's bring people in because as you said, Mr. Chairman, you said, your words, we should never on this committee accept our entity giving us a report and not investigate it ourselves. Undoubtedly, we're well on our way to doing that because of a calendar and a clock. So, Mr. Chairman, I know you're about to give a statement and they've worked on it and you've worked on it very hard, I'm sure. But I want, before you gavel this hearing, before you start your statement, before you go any further, I would like to know two things. Number one, when do you plan on scheduling our minority hearing day? And number two, why or when are we actually going to have real witnesses here that are fact witnesses in this case? When? Or what you said many years ago has faded just like the leaves in fall. I don't really care anymore that somebody else gives us a report. Undoubtedly, Chairman Schiff is chairman over everything with impeachment, and he doesn't get to testify. He's going to send a staff member. But I don't even know if we're going to have a hearing past that to figure out anything that's been going on. So my question as I started out today is, where is fairness? It was promised. It's not being delivered. The facts talked about were not facts delivered. This president, as facts were given, did nothing wrong, nothing to be impeached, and nothing for why we're here. And in the words of one of our witnesses, Mr. Turley, if you rush through this, you do it on flimsy grounds. The American people will not forget the light of history. So today, before you give your opening statement, or your closing statement, before you get to this time, my question is will you talk to this committee? You're chairman. You hold a very prestigious role. Will you let us know where we're going? Or are we going to adjourn from here after you sum up everything, saying that they all did good, and go out from here, we're still wondering? The lights are on. It's time to answer the question. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I want to, before my closing statement, acknowledge that I received a letter today requesting a minority day of testimony under Rule 11. I have not had a chance to read the letter, but look forward to conferring with the ranking member about this request after I have had a chance to review it.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. You can't review a letter. That is a demand that we have.
The gentleman is not recognized.
There's nothing for you to review.
I'll now recognize myself for a closing statement. George Washington's farewell address warns of a moment when cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. President Trump placed his own personal and political interests above our national interests, above the security of our country, and most importantly, above our most precious right, the ability of each and every one of us to participate in fair elections, free of corruption. The Constitution has a solution for a president who places his personal or political interests above those of the nation: the power of impeachment. As one of my colleagues pointed out, I have in the past articulated a three-part test for impeachment. Let me be clear. All three parts of that test have been met. First, yes, the president has committed an impeachable offense. The president asked the foreign government to intervene in our elections, then got caught, then obstructed the investigators. Twice. Our witnesses told us in no uncertain terms that this conduct constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors, including abuse of power. Second, yes, the president's alleged offenses represent a direct threat to the constitutional order. Professor Karlan warned, drawing a foreign government into our election process is an especially serious abuse of power because it undermines democracy itself. Professor Feldman echoed, if we cannot impeach a president who abuses his office for personal advantage, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a monarchy or under a dictatorship. And Professor Gerhardt reminded us, if what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable. President Trump's actions represent a threat to our national security and an urgent threat to the integrity of the next election. Third, yes, we should not proceed unless at least some of the citizens who supported the president in the last election are willing to come with us. A majority of this country is clearly prepared to impeach and remove President Trump. Rather than respond to the unsettling and dangerous evidence, my Republican colleagues have called this process unfair. It is not. Nor is this argument new. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, unable to defend the behavior of the president, have used this argument before. First, they said that these proceedings were not constitutional because we did not have a floor vote. We then had a floor vote. Then they said that our proceedings were not constitutional because they could not call witnesses. Republicans called 3 of the witnesses in the live hearings of the Intelligence Committee and will have an opportunity to request witnesses in this committee as well. Next, they said that our proceedings were not constitutional because the president could not participate. But when the committee invited the president to participate in this hearing, he declined. The simple fact is that all these proceedings have all the protections afforded prior presidents. This process follows the constitutional and legal precedents. So I am left to conclude that the only reason my colleagues rushed from one process complaint to the next is because there is no factual defense for President Trump. Unlike any other president before him, President Trump has openly rejected Congress's right as a co-equal branch of government. He has defied our subpoenas. He has refused to produce any documents, and he directed his aides not to testify. President Trump has also asked the foreign government to intervene in our elections, and he has made clear that if left unchecked, he will do it again. Why? Because he believes that, in his own words, quote, I can do whatever I want, unquote. That is why we must act now. In this country, the president cannot do whatever he wants. In this country, no one, not even the president, is above the law. Today, we began our conversation where we should, with the text of the Constitution. We have heard clearly from our witnesses that the Constitution compels action. Indeed, every witness, including the witness selected by the Republican side, agreed that if President Trump did what the Intelligence Committee found him to have done, after extensive and compelling witnesses from the Trump administration officials, he committed impeachable offenses. While the Republican witness may not be convinced that there is sufficient evidence that the president engaged in these acts, the American people and the majority of this committee disagree. I also think that the Republican witness, Professor Turley, issued a sage warning in 1998 when he was a leading advocate for the impeachment of Bill Clinton. He said, quote, "If you decide that certain acts do not rise to impeachable offenses, you will expand the space for executive conduct," close quote. That was the caution of Professor Turley in 1998 in the impeachment of President Clinton. That caution should guide us all today. And by any account, that warning is infinitely more applicable to the abuses of power we are contemplating today. Because, as we all know, if these abuses go unchecked, they will only continue and only grow worse. Each of us took an oath to defend the Constitution. The President is a continuing threat to that Constitution and to our democracy. I will honor my oath. And as I sit here today, having heard consistent, clear, and compelling evidence that the President has abused his power, attempted to undermine the constitutional role of Congress, and corrupted our elections, I urge my colleagues, stand behind the oath you have taken. Our democracy depends on it. This concludes today's hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I have one thing. Mr. Chairman,
what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8, I am giving notice to intent to file dissenting views to the committee's report on constitutional grounds for presidential impeachment.
Noted. This concludes today's hearing. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our witnesses for participating.
Chairman, I'd ask
without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional material.
We have a unanimous consent request.
Too late. For the witnesses or additional materials for the record.
Consent request?
Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Yeah, that's
Give me a break.
just typical, isn't it? Just typical.